Howdy, everyone. Today's episode, our very first episode where we actually talk about a saint, I'm going to start off with Saint Brendan the Navigator. So Brendan, or Moby, which is his name given at birth, he was born in what we know today to be Tralee, Ireland in 484. He was born as Ireland was moving from a pagan to a Christian country because of the work of St. Patrick. He took the name Brendan at his baptism, and he found himself studying under Saint Ida of Kilidi and Bishop Erk. So might have mispronounced those names, but I think you get the idea. They baptized him, and Bishop Erk became a saint later himself. Brendan, was ordained as a priest around 510 when he was just 26 years old. After he became a priest, Brendan spent the next 20 years founding various monastic communities in Ireland, particularly around the port of Ardfert and in Shankill. His work here led him to become one of the original 12 apostles of Ireland, which is pretty impressive. But I think some of the other stuff that he has done that I'm going to touch on later is equally as, if not more, impressive. All right, so let me get into what Brendan is most known for. Well, at Ardfert, Brendan became fascinated by the sea. He eventually set sail on his very own voyages from there. He kept very detailed logs of his travels. He saw Great Britain, Scotland, Greenland, Iceland, and uncharted areas, but it's not exactly known what these uncharted areas were. There are suggestions that this was North America, but it's not a known fact. However, something that could lend support to him going to North America is that Christopher Columbus studied Brendan's journals prior to setting out on his own voyages, and I think we kind of know how that went. But before I get into Brendan's voyages, I just want to talk about some of the miracles that are attributed to Saint Brendan. The most spectacular miracle that he performed was restoring a deceased young man to life through prayer with the deceased's family. He was traveling to deepen his spiritual connection with God, and he came across a mourning family because, well, their son died. Brendan told them to place their confidence in God, for he has the power to restore the dead to life. And together they prayed, and it's really undescribed as praying for a long time, whether this was 15 minutes, 2 hours, I don't know. But it's a miracle nonetheless happened because the young man rose back from the dead and acted as though nothing ever happened to him. Another miracle that Brendan performed that's kind of interesting is that a man came running across his path and he sought safety from those who were pursuing him. Brendan told this man to go to a rock, and so the man did. He didn't really understand why, but he listened. Brendan prayed, and when the pursuers arrived, they took the rock that the guy was standing next to because from their perspective, the rock was the man and the man was the rock. So somehow what they saw as their reality wasn't the actual reality. It is also said that Brendan was visited by an angel, and this angel would help guide him on his journeys and give him visions so that they could be safe and successful in their travels. So now that I've got Brendan's basics done, I want to talk about his most impressive voyage. And a lot of things that happened on this voyage can be considered miracles in and of themselves, though the verification of this voyage never was fully recognized by the church, so it wasn't able to lend to his canonization as a saint. Brendan's most famous voyage was in search of the Paradise of Saints, or in Latin Terra Repromissionis. I might have mispronounced that, but you get the idea. Sadly, there's no written records of this journey other than Brendan's notes and the oral recounts from the time after he returned. But once the 10th or 11th century turned around, the oral tradition was so strong that some people took it upon themselves to write down the details of the voyage themselves. So starting off the voyage, Brendan announced that he was going to set sail, and a few other monks were like, you know what, we want to go too. So together, Brendan and his crew, about 20 monks, they set sail. They first came across an island that had nothing but a dog and what is described as a great hall. They never saw another living being there, despite being on that island for a few days. But what's interesting is that every time they went to this great hall, there was always food waiting for them. They never had to worry about their needs in that regard. Eventually, they did set sail again, and they found a new island that they called the Island of the Sheep because, maybe you could guess, there was a lot of flocks of sheep there. There was a man called the steward who was basically overseeing the sheep, and he took care of Brendan and the monks' needs. He did instruct them, though, that they needed to set sail to find a new island to celebrate Easter, and the men obliged. So as they resumed their journey, they get to a new island and they started a fire to prepare the meat that the steward had given them. However, once they started the fire, the island began to move. And so scared, they fled back to their ship and returned to the water, only to turn around and discover that it wasn't an island. It was actually Gisconus, who was the largest whale in the world. The men then kind of were forced to find a new island. So they kept sailing and eventually they came across a new island. This island is called the Paradise of the Birds, and it had a inlet river that they could sail up. And sailing up this river, they found a massive tree that was filled with, you could probably guess it, birds. The birds actually sang hymns, though, not just their songs, and they told Brendan that his journey was going to be a long one. The steward actually appeared again at the Isle of Birds, and he took care of Brendan and his monks. But once again, he told them that they would have to set sail, and they listened because they respected this man. They knew he was some sign to guide them along their journey. After many months of sailing from the Paradise of Birds, they found a new island just before Christmas, actually. And when they got to that island, a white-haired man met them, and he took them to the monastery of Saint Ailbe. There were 11 monks at the monastery, all whom had taken a vow of silence, but the abbot broke his silence to tell Brendan that nobody ever cooked at the monastery or tended to the lamps, yet fresh bread was present every day, and the lamps never went out. The abbot also told him that none of the monks aged, and they'd been living there as old men for decades at that point. Brendan and the monks that were with him were in awe at this point because it's just miraculous information to learn. In fact, Brendan was invited to follow the abbot to the chapel one night, and he witnessed a flaming arrow come through a window and replenish the lamps before leaving the window again. Eventually, Brendan and his crew set sail once again, and they sailed until Lent when they returned to the Isle of Sheep. The steward once again greeted them there, and he took care of them and told them that they would repeat the same journey again, observing Easter with Gisconus, and then proceeding to the Paradise of Birds until Pentecost, and finally returned to the monastery of Saint Ailbe for Christmas. So Brendan and his crew repeated this journey for years to come. Throughout their voyages, Brendan and the monks were attacked by various beasts, but a larger beast always appeared and killed whatever was attacking them before any of them got hurt. After years of voyaging, they came across a new island, which is surprising given their familiarity with the sailing route at this point. They'd been doing it for years. At this island, there's an old monk at a cave, and this monk told Brendan that he had accompanied St. Patrick and has been a hermit on the island for over 90 years. The monk also told Brendan that without the steward, they would never find the paradise of saints that they were after. Once again, the crew returned to the Island of Sheep, but upon leaving it this time, the steward told them that he was going to accompany them. They gladly accepted him into their crew, and after sailing for a month, fog surrounded their boat. The steward told them this was always the case around the Paradise of Saints, and eventually the fog broke into a bright light, and they found themselves at a wondrous land covered in fruit-filled trees. They explored this land for 40 days, never finding an end to it. They found a large river where a young man greeted each of them by name. He also told them that they would need to leave soon, as Brendan's life was nearing its end. They gathered fruit and began their return to the boat to set sail back to where they came from. The young man told them that the land would become known to Brendan's successor when Christians faced persecution, and Brendan and the monks got back to their vessel and set sail to return to Ireland. Eventually, they arrived back to Ireland, and in Clonfert, the monks greeted them enthusiastically. Brendan recounted their voyages and told them how he learned that his life was coming to an end, so they prepared for his death, and soon thereafter, Brendan passed away. It took 7 years for the voyage to be completed in total, and the true location of the Paradise of Saints is heavily debated. Even its existence is debated by many who aren't faithful, who don't believe, it sounds impossible. So some things you just have to believe in with minimal evidence. Personally, I don't really see a reason to doubt that the voyage took place, especially considering there were notable other voyagers and navigators that studied Brendan's journals, but I'm not sure where the Paradise of Saints was or is actually located. Now, the possible locations for the Paradise vary from the Canary Islands to Madeira to some islands off the coast of Ireland even, and they even go as far as North America, which I mentioned earlier. The description is just one of a beautiful land, so it's kind of open to interpretation. There's a little bit of suggestion with spectacular vegetation being present, but that really doesn't rule out a whole lot of options. Being from Ireland, many of these places could be seen as possible locations for the Paradise of Saints. So the leading suggestion or argument against the land being America is that it was 550 approximately. Brendan died in 577. The voyage took around 7 years. So maybe it was 570 when they did it. But either way, that's centuries before Columbus sailed. So many people say it's simply impossible to get from Ireland to America with the technology they had at the time. However, a very interesting fact is that in 1976 to 1977, Tim Severin successfully sailed a leather-wrapped boat that he built that was supposed to be a replica of the one Brendan would have used, and he traveled from Ireland to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland to Newfoundland. So he proved that this voyage Brendan went on could have been to America. It's not impossible. Given Brendan's navigational expertise, I do think it's reasonable to assume that he could have gotten to America. And I encourage you to do your own research because there's a lot of information about Saint Brendan, and there's so much oral tradition surrounding him that there's different explanations for some of the stuff that happened. This is just the stuff that I personally believe is most likely, or what I found to be the most interesting, at least. So yeah, what do you think? Do you think Brendan went to North America? Do you think he went somewhere else? Do you even think the voyage happened? It's kind of open to your level of faith, really. Feel free to leave a comment about this, to talk to those around you about it, study it more if it interests you. If you have your own theories, I'm more than happy to hear them. I would love to hear new theories about what Brendan's voyages could have been, because it truly is fascinating to me. As I said before, Brendan died in 577. He was 93 years old. He was buried in a simple grave outside the cathedral at his most famous monastery in Clonfert. His travels were only written down centuries after his death outside of his own journals, and the oral traditions added the details to these stories to fill them out, to make them even more impressive. The book that they are recorded in is called Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, and I might have mispronounced that, but hopefully you can do a quick little search and find it if you want to. But there are translations available. You don't have to read it in Latin simply because the title is in Latin. He's the patron saint of sailors and the U.S. Navy, which makes sense. He's also a patron saint to those who are afraid because of the fearlessness he presented sailing the oceans. His feast day is May 16th. Thanks all for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.